Well, thank you for joining me in this talk. I actually want to especially thank you for those who are listening to this talk. Some talks and some topics they have a more general appeal. People are they're a natural response to maybe the name of the talk, but with a talk like this, talking about our mistakes, our failures, the human imperfections in which we all experience in our lives, it takes a bit of courage. It takes a bit of honesty and sincerity to be willing and vulnerable enough to admit that yes, I have human frailty. I have made mistakes, and it's likely I will make a mistake again. I've failed, and I will fail again. Most of us live in a kind of denial of that truth, hoping that somehow one day things will change in some fundamental way, and that won't be the case anymore. That if somehow I grow and expand and become better than how I am now, maybe I can remove all the things about myself and our shared humanity that I wish not to accept. And this is going to be a radically different way of looking at the challenge in our lives, the condition of being human, what that means to be in a state of imperfection almost, at least on the surface of things. And so this talk, the Tao of mistakes, the Tao of failure, the Tao of imperfection. The word Tao, it means the way of things, the way things are, the way in which the universe flows. You can almost think of it as like an energetic formula of how life moves. It's a description. And one of the most beautiful things about the Tao is the symbol of the yin and the yang, which is associated with the Tao. The imagery of the light and the dark and the balance between the two that is so clear in its nonverbal communication through the symbol, as you can see here, of light and dark, and the balance of the two, where in dark you find light and how dark exists in light. That paradox of our existence, it challenges one of the deepest parts of ourselves, which is a untenable preference for the light over the dark, for good over bad, for pleasure over pain, for success over failure. That preference in us can make it very hard to accept the truth that is so clear and simple, that's communicated in the Tao, and especially in the yin and the yang, and the symbol of the Tao, the way of things. And it's this idea that light and dark exist together. Their existence weaves the universe together, and there is no life without light and dark. But yet that preference that we all are seemingly born with, and there's even research that shows that young humans who have yet to be conditioned by ideas of what good and bad, light and dark is, they show a natural tendency to identify with lightness, with goodness over dark. And so that preference it's almost ingrained within our nervous systems. It's even in many ways the survival instinct, beginning to manifest in its preferences and subtle ways of things. And yet there's a truth in it, to just rotely accept that life is a 50% good and 50% bad, and that's just a way of things. That doesn't feel good in our nervous system, and there's a reason for that. That's not true either. But to understand what the symbol of the yin and the yang is intending to impart onto you and into us, it requires us to understand what is light and what is dark, and to look into the dark, to go into the heart of darkness. We avoid that to all ends. We run from that for most, if not all, of our lives. And again, that's natural. And the truth and the preference of light over dark is that there's a reality to light that darkness does not share in. Darkness exists as a shadow of the light. It exists in shadows. It exists where light is not. Shadows, they're only real in relationship to light. Light can be without shadow, but shadow it's somehow made from light. In many ways, you can look at darkness as it's our inner light that is existing in a state of confusion, a state of ignorance, and therefore a state of pain and suffering. And that pain and suffering is where the aversion to dark comes from. But yet, especially when you begin to see that light and dark, or dark, exists as the shadow of light, you can see how in any given moment there is the potential for confusion, for arrogance, for malcontent. And that is what the Tao is attempting to communicate, the ever-present potential of shadow and light. Moment by moment, light and dark in the forms of confusion, distortion, misunderstanding. Those can manifest, and they have consequences. Oftentimes it's the consequences that we wince at most. It makes it most difficult to look. We're so afraid to hurt ourselves and especially others that we would prefer to deny the reality of the dark altogether and simply pray that one day somehow there will only be light. Maybe if I work hard enough, if I better myself enough, somehow I will rid myself of the dark that I see or avoid within myself. And that simply won't work. It's not the way of things. That's not how things are. And the degree of distortion in our perception of the way things are, the varying contrast between how we perceive things and how things actually are, therein lies the scope and the magnitude of your suffering. The more aligned your perception is with the way of things, the less, if any, you will suffer. And the more out of aligned, the more distorted, confused, twisted your perception becomes of life, the more unbearable that state will be. And it's perhaps one of the greatest ironies of this great koan, this great riddle of light and dark that's demonstrated in the yin and the yang, is the degree to which we cling to light oftentimes is the degree to which darkness can fester either in ourselves, or we can be more susceptible to being victimized or preyed upon by the darkness and the confusion, the distortion, the misunderstanding that obviously occupies a large scale of our humanity. And those who are more willing to look, to see, to understand the darkness, the confusion, the arrogance, the greed, the misfortune, those beings are far less likely to have darkness actualized in their lives to a great degree. Of course, we're all, as I said before, likely to mistake and err, to fall to the lower ways of our nature. And yet, if we are unable to accept that that is an almost inevitable human potential, if we exist in denial of that, we are inextricably clutched by the very mechanism of darkness. Because, again, darkness is a shadow. It can only exist in the absence of light. Your refusal to look is how darkness continues in your life. And so that's why mistakes are failures, are imperfections. That's why therein lies our greatest potentials for growth, transformation, and transcendence. When we are willing to look into the places that are uncomfortable to look, we are most activated by our greatest potential. You know, in the Tao of things, to just call it the Tao of mistakes and imperfections, it can feel a bit like an imbalance, and it's true. You know, the light side of our mistakes is, you know, actualizing, growing, evolving, becoming, expanding more and more in ways that inherently feel good. That preference, you know, can help us grow and evolve to a great extent. But because that is our preference, it's like in many ways I'm not concerned about whether or not that would flower in your lives. It's incredibly natural if exposed to an opportunity to grow and to expand and to understand deeper truths and wisdoms of yourself and of life. You, like anyone else, would jump on the opportunity. In fact, many of us are begging for such an opportunity to come. And so, to address the other side, the place where that preference causes us to turn away from, therein lies our greatest power. You know, again, we will naturally move towards the light side of growth. You know, but growth is also painful. Physically, it's assumed that as you are growing, you know, in our childhood, we'll experience growing pains, and that's natural. It's not so feared because it's seen as natural. But that's equally as true for our inner being, our emotions, our psychology, our spirit. The willingness to touch the dark, uncomfortable. You know, it's actually from there that true grace comes from. The light of grace, you know, our capacity to forgive. That is the light touching the dark, and so freeing the dark, you know, or freeing the light within the dark. You can think of it. You know, it's like if you imagine two scenarios of, you know, violence in an environment or unconditional forgiveness, radical acceptance. Which of those two scenarios would you say that dark is most likely to fester and continue? It's obviously in the violence, which is a denial of our human nature and its confused potentials. And so in all of our lives, we are invariably confronted by our own mistakes, our failures, our imperfections. And if we hold on to this idea of life or of ourselves as totally good, 100% good, without the slightest stain of darkness accepted, and if it's there, we just have to deny it because it's too painful to look. That way of things, that way of perceiving life, that is not the way life is. And so it will only continue to take you back to where you always have been, in this cycle of avoidance, denial. At some point you pick yourself off your feet and you continue to motivate yourself to an imagined future where somehow light wins the war against dark. And that doesn't happen, at least not in the way we imagine it when we're in a state of avoidance and denial. And yet, our mistakes, our imperfections, our failures, therein lies some of the most challenging parts of our lives to accept, to be at peace with. And that's why, again, therein lies our greatest potential for growth and transformation. When we are willing to acknowledge the lesser parts of ourselves without crumbling, collapsing. When we are willing to forgive and love ourselves in the midst of our imperfections. It's the moment after failure. It's the moment after a mistake, or the couple days after, where you will see how cruel and harsh you are to yourself. And if you can address that, if you can look at that critic in yourself that is so judging of ourselves and of others, and if you can open and soften and receive the discomfort of mistakes. It's uncomfortable for a reason. It's trying to show you the way, but your unwillingness to feel the discomfort blocks you from learning the lessons of our mistakes, and it keeps you on the cycle. If you're not willing to feel the discomfort of failure, you won't learn what would allow you to succeed one day, to transcend and surpass. And again, it's not a transcending or a surpassing or a growth that removes the dark. It's a softening through understanding. When you see dark misunderstanding with clarity, your heart opens with compassion because you see it for what it is. It's a state of suffering born from an untrue perception of life. It is suffering, and it is painfully contracting and expressing its contraction in its life because it's holding on to an idea of life that's not true, and it's suffering its own delusions. When we make a mistake, whether we're just simply not perfect, or whether it's more of a moral mistake, we are making those mistakes because there is a part of us that is confused, that doesn't understand. And those parts of us that are confused, they're afraid. And so the way in relating to those areas of our psyche, it's not through harsh criticism that only exacerbates its pain. It's through soft and compassionate listening, understanding, and radical acceptance. One of my teachers talked about this as it's like seeing a lost child in the forest. What's your intuitive response if you come across a confused and scared child that's wandering through a forest and doesn't know its way home. You shelter, you provide shelter, you encourage, you nurture, you tell it that everything's going to be okay. Because it is. Because everything is already okay. You know, once you remove yourself from the war of light and dark, you're no longer holding on to hope of a future that is the okayness that the dark that's present in our lives makes us feel that somehow things are not okay. But things are already okay. Again, that's what the Tao speaks to. The yin and the yang. It's the innate balance of the universe. And it's as it is. As it always will be. And the degree to which you open and accept the reality that already is will be the degree to which you not only not suffer it, but you begin to celebrate the great Tao, the great harmony of life. But yet it can be so hard to forgive ourselves. Could wish for anything else. To accept your erring ways. It requires an immense amount of humility. You know, a lot of times if we're very strong-willed, it can take quite a while of life grinding us down until we're finally willing to crack open and allow our vulnerable, soft core to shine outwardly. That shining of our core sounds very poetic and lovely, but it's the part of us that shines most is the part of us that's most vulnerable, and allowing it to be, to exist and be felt is there can be immensely uncomfortable, at least in the beginning, as you work through all of your fears around it. But when you can accept the potential, at least for dark, when you don't judge yourself and your actions by whether they fulfilled the perfection that you intuit is of the light nature of our reality, when you allow room to grow and make mistakes and learn, there's a great unburdening. Home is not somewhere else. Home is not when you become perfect, and therefore finally, because when you're perfect, no one can ever judge you, and therefore you can rest. It's not like that. When you stop judging yourself, rest is abundantly available. When you stop holding the idea of yourself to a pedestal that it can never fulfill in the way that you imagine it, when you stop chasing it, you're free to rest right now. You're home whenever you want to be, whenever you accept the way of things, the way things truly are. And when you cease being afraid of mistakes and failures, of your human imperfections, you have an actual chance to understand the roots of your confusion. And ironically, there becomes the window for light to prevail, for spirit to claim victory in your life. When you're no longer afraid to look at what's dark, the light of yourself can begin to wash it away. You know, what happens to a dark room when you open a window? Where does the darkness go? Was the darkness something that concretely existed before the window opened? Or was it simply an absence of the light that is real? So when you look into yourselves, into your mistakes, you are looking at your confusion, but underneath your confusion, where your confusion comes from, the innate being or what's real, that is light. Darkness exists as a shadow, and the shadow persists as long as we are too afraid to look. When we look, we are shining the light of ourselves, of our awareness, of the source from which we come. We are shining that timeless light of our true nature and casting away shadow. But I'm careful to go into that kind of language because it could sound like I'm setting up another kind of war of light and dark where the goal is to now rid the shadow and the confusion, and that's again not true. That comes from, again, a denial, a resistance, a wishing things were different, praying for the day where there's only light. There actually is only light, but because we have an idea of darkness, we will experience it as a potential. When someone is in a state of darkness, they're in a state of confusion. Their perception is not true, and therefore they suffer it. And because their perception is not true, there's a way that you can say that it's not real, but yet it obviously happens. We obviously undergo states of suffering. And to simply say it's not real, it doesn't really help. Although we seemingly really like to do it in at least some spiritual circles, but it's a kind of immature game that hopefully we grow out of when we're willing to be humbled by our imperfection. It's a very fascinating part of the spiritual journey. Again, this kind of goes at the Tao of the one side, the light that is a natural preference, to, as a human being, to wake up to your real nature, to become enlightened by the reality of the isness of all existence. It calls to us in this deep and powerful way. We're drawn towards the light. And that's, again, not really something you have to or you can even encourage. It's, when that's active in someone, they're going to find their way, try as you may to stop them if for some reason you have a resistance to their pursuit of their own enlightenment. But on the other side of that coin, as life itself, as perfection itself, to come to terms and accept our human imperfection. That's the more challenging side of the coin. It's easy to transcend our humanity into spirit. It's hard to come down from spirit back into our humanity, to embody wherever we are in our human journey. A lot of times, especially if you go through some awakenings, it actually exacerbates our denial of our human imperfections. Because now it's not just an idea, it's not just a belief, we have touched, the essence, which is perfect. It is perfect. And the experience of that perfection can cause the experience of imperfection to be that much more painful. And so it takes a great deal of courage, a great deal of willingness, an unbelievable amount of love for our humanity to come back down, to be at peace with wherever your human expression is in its evolution towards simply the joy of becoming a more refined mirror for that which we truly are to express itself. But if we're so wrapped up in judging our humanity for how well it can, embody our deepest experience, it's not really fair to our humanity, because that's quite a momentous task to embody perfection. And yet, if we are in denial of our mistakes, we are caught in that wheel whereby the only way we can accept ourselves and the only way we can find rest is by somehow achieving a state of perfection, which we relentlessly pursue. And ironically, that closes us off from the perfection that's already here. Perfection is the way of things. It's the infinite harmony. Light and dark, shadow and light, all here, at least as potential. And no matter how far you journey, that potential never ceases. There's no threshold through which you can never make a mistake. That's not real. But it requires a deep humility to open to that truth. Many times we have to fail over and over and over again until we fail at trying to succeed. When you fail at trying to succeed, you're at least starting to get somewhere. Opening to perhaps, my dogmatic pursuit of the idea of perfection, or the idea of what my full potential is as a human being. Perhaps that's simply not helpful, or not working at least. But again, to admit that, it's like we're leaving ourselves naked and vulnerable. What is my reference if I'm not pursuing perfection? If I'm not vehemently consumed by the war of light and dark and my side in things, and wanting, wherever I see light, because how often is it that you're fighting for light while someone's calling you dark, in the strange play of the world, at least as it's currently constructed. But again, right in the center of this great harmony of light and dark, you can find profound rest anytime you're willing to allow your human condition to be exactly as it is. To cease making yourself such a big deal, as if it's all up to you whether or not light prevails. And it's kind of funny when you think about that. It's quite foolish, It just doesn't make sense. There's greater powers working in our universe than myself, or I hope anyone listening who knows, though. But I don't know what's more powerful than the light within us that's willing to look onto the dark, not to change it, to get rid of it, but just to unconditionally see it, radical acceptance, true forgiveness. True forgiveness where you're willing to feel the pain of dark with whatever the object of dark appears in front of you as, yourself or another. To admit to our own confusions, the places within us that we haven't fully grown and evolved. To rest despite not achieving perfection. Yet we can't do that until we, through a moment of grace, somehow this mechanism that keeps us chained to this imagined war of light and dark, when that ceases for a moment, you can taste the perfection that's inherent to life, to yourself, what you are, the truth of our shared nature. The perfections here, it's not anywhere else. And if you do a million things and change a million things, you'll still be here. The here that's now will not be different in an imagined future. It will be the same here and now. The surface of things can change immensely, but the essence of things remains the same. The more you tune your attention into that essence, the more you naturally embody the great harmony of light and dark, the yin and the yang. The more you see them as interconnected opposites that don't. They have no conflict despite being opposites. In our minds, opposites, to hold opposites simultaneously is actually called cognitive dissonance, and it's described as a state of discomfort because our minds can't do that. We have to go below or deeper or higher depending on how it resonates with you. We have to somehow transcend the limitations of our minds to find the harmony of opposites. And that's the Tao, the harmony of opposites. That within us, which can see light and dark, good and bad, right and wrong, with equanimous eyes. That is our true nature. That is what we are. That is what we've always been. And we're on a journey that can feel more like an adventure of discovering a light, understanding the dark, learning how to commune together in a way that celebrates the truth that we all share. But when we deny the parts within us that are too uncomfortable to experience directly, and so we force our attention away, we contract. When we do that, we cannot allow the places within us that we deny to exist in our world. And that's why we go to war. That's why we fight. When I deny myself, I deny all of humanity. I am in conflict with life because I have not found the great harmony of the way of things. The most terrifying thing to be fully yourself, right here and now. Strip away all ideas of change and simply be what you are, here and now, before even the idea of here and now. You are yourself before you thought of yourself. You are yourself before you felt any particular way about yourself. Your existence is fundamental. Even the light switch of consciousness fluctuates in your great being, in the great immensity that you are. Light and dark play and dance in front of you as the pure and eternal presence that gives witness to all of life, its infinite creation that comes from the great harmony of light and dark. So turning towards the dark liberates the light. Running from the dark allows it to persist. So I wish you tremendously well on this journey to nowhere, to coming fully into being truly here without ideas of becoming goals that become burdens, to freely and lightly be exactly as you are. That's true freedom. That's embodied spirituality. Accepting the journey of our humanity and stop insisting that we demonstrate perfection constantly. You know, the peak moments, sure, it's beautiful, but to demand perfection, to demand what's perfect in us to express perfectly, it's not realistic. And it's an immense burden that I wish you shed as myself as well. So I hope you enjoyed this talk, and it was great to be with you and share some time and space together.